You can become a thunder god that calls lightning storms, slows down time, and summons ethereal monsters all in one in Mortal Shell 2, or a grim reaper that sustains and buffs itself by consuming the very hearts he rips out of his foes. It would be hard to not notice the incredible leap Mortal Shell 2 made over its predecessor, and although it's not without its flaws, especially of the performance kind, the game does a lot to prove it's more than just another Souls-like. Whether it succeeds at that or not, we're going to discuss in this review, and on that note, I want to give a big thanks to Cold Symmetry for providing an early key. That being said, the open demo already made a solid impression, and I'm happy to report the review version saw significant improvements on top. Especially when it comes to character control and general floatiness, it was mostly fixed, or at the very least, nowhere near as noticeable in regular gameplay. Moment-to-moment combat also felt solid, with a weight behind every blow and a satisfying oomph during perfect guards and executions. Every weapon and every hit made combat feel highly addictive, prolonging enjoyment with every new encounter even after dozens of hours of playtime. With one drawback I want to state, being that finishing moves felt a bit repetitive at times. It was the same handful of animations playing, which I was kinda hoping would change depending on the weapon used, but that wasn't the case. I did however notice some mobs were harder to flinch from attacks compared to the open demo, especially with the quicker weapons such as the axe and dagger, meaning enemies would not get interrupted quite as easily as before, and as such felt more punishing when trying to rush. All in all, this contributed to a welcomed bump in difficulty. But by far the biggest contributor to what makes Mortal Shell 2 unique is its approach to the class system. You can find, unlock, and max out 8 different shells, plus the one in the prologue, and every single one of them felt unique yet still powerful. I finished my first run with Proxima, and her combat style was highly addictive. Her biosampler especially is an amazing gap closing tool, which can be further specialized into providing different buffs or debuffs on the target. My favorite being the version that calls down literal lightning storms to strike all nearby targets. This oftentimes resulted in a spectacle of flashy lights, which some may call seizure-inducing, but if you know me, this is exactly right up my alley. They weren't just there for the show, those storms carry a serious punch, and they are amazing at interrupting enemies, an understated advantage when overrun by enemies. Not all classes were the same though, some felt more powerful than others, with a couple of them being downright broken OP with a proper setup. One in particular felt as if I was literally playing as Dio, trapping the whole world in an infinite, with nothing more that they could do to stop me, unless developers moved in to nerf it. That or having countless clones take down a whole battlefield are just some of the absurd ways this game lets you approach combat. Building these classes up is also done via a bonding-like mechanic, where you can use a resource called Glimpse to reveal more of that shell's backstory, which in turn opens up new skill lines. This gave the class system both a utilitarian role, but also a way to form a personal connection by having a glimpse into that character's past lives and decisions. And since Glimpse is found via exploration, cleansing beacons, and a few other methods too, it ties class building very well with exploration in a loop that practically feeds itself. Some of these lives carried themes of honor, friendship, or sacrifice, while others were more straightforward, reflecting the banality of everyday life and how quickly it can end, like unlocking the shell of a mighty warrior because he decided to drink himself to death in a random bar one day. Since your character is separate from the shell, aka the class it inhabits, there's nothing prohibiting you from trying them all out in one single playthrough. You just have to find them first. Although realistically, you can max out roughly 2 or 3 classes by the time you can jump into New Game Plus. But Mortal Shell always had an interesting proposition for the Soul's Death loop cycle. The whole idea of getting knocked out of your body and having to fight to get it back proved that this is more than a second chance at staying alive. And I admit it, I was a bit skeptical at first about making the Harbinger tankier in the sequel, expecting a drop in difficulty. However, I couldn't be further from the truth. The feeling of going in a fight overly confident, only to get a quick out-of-body experience from a well-placed enemy blow, becomes a hard reality check as the stakes get raised ever so higher. It no longer becomes a difficulty drop, but rather it forces you to lock in and to adapt. While yes, your core Harbinger can be leveled up separately, it still pales in comparison to the shells you inhabit. You won't die just in one hit, that's true, but it won't take more than 2 or 3 either before even the most basic foe sends you on a one-way trip to your last beacon. Moments like these are what prolonged and even amplified the suspense, especially as the game went on and enemies became even more challenging. Speaking of that, generally I would call the enemy and boss design quite inspiring. With a fair few oh snap moments, I thought I'd sure be a goner. Most of these fights are clearly meant to emphasize the game's biggest strengths even more, such as the fluid animations, the satisfying parries, and the impactful blows. For the majority of the encounters, I found a really solid balance between fun and difficulty that should satisfy both Souls and non-Souls fans likewise. As somebody who went quite deep in the genre in the past, it didn't feel like I needed more than 2 or 3 repeats to overcome even the most challenging encounters, but the game does offer a solution even for somebody like me. There's a certain NPC early on that can increase the difficulty in a very organic kind of way. By calling down the night, this changes the number of spawned enemies, their attack patterns, and even populates the former world with way more traps and challenges. The point is, Mortal Shell 2 does a solid job at satisfying a lot of different tastes when it comes to the Souls genre. However, I'd be remiss to not point out the number of reused enemies and animations which became more apparent as the game went on. While this mostly affected regular foes, it did still feel a bit like deja vu fighting the same spear knight, rock-throwing troll, or multi-legged creature for the 1000th time from early all the way to endgame. Going up against a mean-looking new boss only to see it reusing the exact same attack patterns as the dozens of trolls I fought and defeated until then felt a little jarring. Normally, I'd be more upset about this in a typical full-priced AAA game, but Mortal Shell 2 sells for $50 for the base version, so I think it's only appropriate we judge it with this metric in mind. Overall, I will still say this didn't take away from my enjoyment, nor did it necessarily impact the game quality, and if that was one of the cost-saving measures they took to sell the game at a lower price, then this is a concession I'm willing to make. But where the game did not make any sacrifices are the world and level design. Mortal Shell 2 is bigger and bolder by almost every metric compared to its predecessor. Cold Symmetry managed to create a world that feels much larger than it actually is, and that's partly because of the sheer number of ways various areas interconnect with one another. Cleverly hidden paths and zones that loop with one another give me a sense of scale that made me feel small and insignificant, which otherwise contributed to a greater level of immersion. The game hasn't just grown up in sheer scale, but also in verticality. Launch pads, jump gates, trapdoors, and elevators bring you to destinations once thought impossible to reach. Every time I thought I was almost done with an area, there lied a whole new path, which branched into a whole new direction, a new dungeon to discover, or some other kind of secret that made my search worthwhile. The game world is overly abundant with secret cellars that bring you to entire dungeons beneath the surface. And while many of them still suffered from the same copy and paste problem we talked about earlier, that was mostly relegated to the entrance area. Specifically, it seems to be the same elevator that always brings you down towards the entrance, but what lies beneath almost always seemed to be different. I didn't recall any layout of any two dungeons ever being similar. It also helps that there's a much higher diversity of biomes this time around. Early villages do have their charm, but you quickly get to discover abandoned castles, overrun battlefields, lush red forests, all the way to ancient, almost alien-like lands, just to name some. These and the game's graphics contributed to what's essentially a very atmospheric and cinematic game setting, with towering structures in the distance being a constant reminder there's still something waiting for you beyond the horizon. It takes roughly 20 to 30 hours to finish the whole story, but you're looking at probably double that if you're taking a completionist approach to discover every nook and cranny. The point is, exploration felt highly rewarding and it had the loot to back it up. And since we're on the subject of loot, that was another aspect of Mortal Shell 2 that I found highly satisfying. Every single class in fact featured 2, even 3 different playstyles you can specialize into to take advantage of various aspects of their builds. This may sound like it isn't much, but it gets even wilder once you factor in the dozens of different tar stones and other trinkets that provide unique new abilities or change how effects and weapons work altogether. Every single one of these items can be leveled up and upgraded for even stronger effects. One of the best examples being Imbuement Stones. When maxed out, they fully provide all of their effects permanently without needing to reapply them. So imagine running a bleed build setup where the effect never fades and never has to be reapplied. It's there on your weapon constantly. There are tons of such effects, from typical fire, freeze, poison and shock, all the way to stasis, slow time, stance break build-up, even curses which can randomly apply multiple such effects with higher application all in one go. Factor in that every class can use every weapon and every sidearm, and you're looking at a high build diversity ceiling that can cover almost any playstyle. If you want a pair of rogue weapons on a tank, that can work surprisingly well actually, and it's just one of the examples. You pretty much have everything for every playstyle. If you want to play with a two-hander that works in slow but deals hard damage, that's an option. If you want to play with two-handers for speed, that is also another one. My only gripe with this system is that some of the stones affected only certain types of weapons for no discernible reason. The aforementioned implement stones are the biggest offender, as many of them only affect 2 or 3 types of weapons instead of all of them at the same time. For example, Arbiter's Prize, which gives Blood Curse, only seems to affect the Axe and Dagger, Iconoclast, and the Scythe, but not any of the others like the Axe-Katana, which makes no sense. I mean, Axe and Dagger and Axe-Katana play very similarly, as both of them are quick dual-wield weapons for the most part. I think that was a mistake on the developer's part, and most of these stones should be made available for all weapon types. Now, story-wise, you're a Harbinger, a featureless ethereal entity tasked with the critical mission of retrieving the ova, basically stolen eggs of a sacred entity we call the Undermother, for reasons that we yet not understand, but ones that actually make sense and tie in very well with the story conclusion and what lies beyond it. In this journey, you'll embark across a corrupted fantasy realm, fighting twisted monsters, religious fanatics, and false gods to retrieve said ova. The game isn't too heavy on cutscenes either, but rather in typical Souls fashion, the narrative is contextualized through environmental storytelling, between war-torn lands, endless battlefields, secret torture chambers, and altars of demonic worship, providing context to what was lost and what's at stake. Cryptic messages are often relayed through tattered pages for those seeking deeper meaning. Now, the game is not without its fair share of surprises either. I'm a big fan of how developers thought of handling consumables here. They basically done it via a mechanic called familiarity. So the more of a certain consumable you find, the more familiar you get with it, which in turn makes it a lot more potent. And all of them have both active and passive effects depending on the type of slot you decide to allocate them to. For example, Moonshine just restores resolve when you place it in the active slot. However, if you place it in the passive one, it gives a flat damage reduction. The same goes for Wild Caps and other resistance items, increasing both in potency and number of charges with more copies that you find in the wild, which makes collecting even the most insignificant of items feel like a progression in and of itself. And there are some items in there that can do way more, such as summoning specters of violent beasts whenever you attack with a melee weapon, a summon chance that only increases with more copies of said items that you get to find. The results can oftentimes be quite surprising. Now, in the intro, I also mentioned performance issues, and unfortunately, I have to relay that Mortal Shell 2 does suffer from quite a few of them. Despite running this game on what I would call a pretty decent setup, I was constantly bombarded with severe frame drops when transitioning, especially in new areas, which leads me to believe this issue relates to the way the game loads world assets. Even disabling some of the biggest resource hogs did not completely remove it. So if you end up with the same issues I did, here are some of the settings I turned off which helped quite a bit. One of them was the seamless dungeon loading. This basically makes it so that all of the loading screens for dungeons are completely removed, which is definitely awesome, but it comes at a very steep cost, having them almost always constantly loaded in the background, or at the very least that's what I suspect this does. And turning it off did make a pretty big impact, and so did turning off other huge offenders like turning off ray tracing and bringing the settings all the way down to high, although still I had hangups even after this every now and then, so hopefully that's going to get fixed at least with a day 1 patch. Another issue which bugged me even more relates to various class mechanics that simply either did not work well or simply did not work at all. Just to name a few, almost every attack that tracks targets, such as Gragu's Staggering Blow or Teal's Shadow Strike, had a very poor enemy tracking and would oftentimes either miss or hit the animation at a very weird angle. The problem here is that some of these builds are highly dependent on hitting the enemies at the right spot. Just to name a few examples, if you run Teal's Shadow Strike build with the damage from behind modifier, you can really take advantage of it because for some reason the targets turn around in place literally in a split second during that animation, which prevents the damage multiplier from applying altogether. For Staggering Blow it may be even worse, as various builds for Gragu rely on this very ability to land so that you can extract the hearts out of your enemies, and since Gragu uses a completely separate healing mechanic, this means having half of its kit basically disabled. Same with Sariel and his Thornfall upgrade. It has such bad tracking that oftentimes the skill either completely missed every single target or landed in areas that weren't even on my screen. That's how bad it ended up being. Now fortunately most of these issues sound easily fixable. Hopefully it happens fast with a day 1 patch, but I'm afraid they take away quite a lot from the otherwise very enjoyable experience if the developers don't act upon it quickly. Anyway, overall, this has been a much more enjoyable game than I thought it would be, and if you fancy the idea behind the first Mortal Shell but could not get into it, well, the sequel is much better and bigger in every single way, much more polished despite the bugs and performance issues, and much more fluid. Plus the build diversity is there. So to summarize the positives and the negatives, on the upside, Mortal Shell 2 features a very satisfying combat, solid class system, amazing progression, great level design, and a gorgeous open world. On the downside, it was unfortunately marred by performance issues, quite a lot of bugs, reused animations, and repeat encounters. I suspect a lot of these of the performance kind can be fixed, but for a $50 game, this is bringing AAA quality when typical AAAs are now looking to increase the prices even further. Do let me know in the comments if any of this makes you more reluctant or more eager to give Mortal Shell 2 a go. In the meantime, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.